Welcome to Heresy Financial. My name is Joseph Brown, and today we're going to be discussing the question, are recessions a thing of the past? The market is hitting all-time highs day in and day out. There are people saying that this is the best economy that we've ever had. Is it possible that recessions are finally a thing of the past? The answer is yes. Hold up. Before you jump all over me and start throwing quotes at me of all the times people have predicted that the market would continue to go up endlessly and continuously and we have the greatest economy ever right before there was some sort of big financial crisis or crash, those predictions are everywhere. And that's not what I'm doing today. Hang in here with me. We're going to look at why recessions might be a thing of the past and why that may not actually be a good thing whatsoever. Let's dive in. Alright, before we answer the question appropriately whether recessions might actually be a thing of the past and something we may never see or face again, the first thing we have to do is actually define what is a recession. A recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters with a fall in GDP. So despite how much the word is thrown around and people use it to casually refer to a general financial crisis or a lack of growth or people not feeling great about the economy or their job or whatever it is, recession has a very precise definition, which is 2 consecutive quarters of a fall in GDP. Man, what is it with this guy? One minute he's saying we're in for a crash, and the next minute he's saying we may never actually have 2 consecutive quarters of a fall in the GDP ever again. Are you kidding me? Just last month he was saying it's the end of the world. Come on. Hang with me here, it'll make sense in a minute. There are many analysts and economists and people like myself who have said we never actually cured or healed from the problems that caused the great financial crisis in the first place, and a lot of what we did was kick the can down the road and just delayed some of the worst consequences and pushed them out as far as we could, and we are bound to hit those at some point soon here. And so these same people have been predicting crash, collapse, recession for years now, and it seems like the market is impervious. It seems like we continue to chug along forward. There's no stopping this economy, no recession in sight. So what is going on? The question that most people never ask is, what is GDP? And is GDP actually a reliable measure of the economy? So what we're going to do here is we're going to break down what GDP actually is, how it's measured, what it leaves out, and we're going to show why it's not an accurate representation of growth in any economy. Credit to Alistair McLeod here, who has produced most of the research that's gone into this video here. You can see his article on Gold Money. I'll link it below in the description. Okay, so simply defined, what is GDP? Because people usually refer to it as basically just growth. If GDP is up, we have growth. But obviously, it's going to be a little bit more nuanced than that. So how is it calculated? Well, the first thing you need to understand is that GDP is calculated as a static, evenly rotating model, which right off the bat should throw up alarm signals because it's an economy. It's not an equation. When you have inputs to come up with a calculation and output that's supposed to show the health of an economy that doesn't take into account time preference, just individual preference on money versus goods and services, technology increasing, creative destruction taking out and producing new industries. Right off the bat, when you have a static, evenly rotating model, you're going to have problems. So here's how it's calculated. It takes the value added that's created through the production of goods and services during a certain period of time in a specific country, in our case, America. Then it measures the income from that production, or the total amount spent on those goods and services minus imports. So now we see on this second point how incomplete GDP is because of the things that it excludes from its model. It does not include the sale of used goods. It doesn't include black market transactions. It doesn't include welfare payments by the government, and it doesn't include intermediate goods that are used to produce final goods. On the flip side, it does include an increase in inventories regardless of whether or not those inventories get sold or not. And finally, it excludes asset transactions besides buildings. And this point is hugely important because it excludes asset transfers, which make up a huge portion of an economy. So when a central bank is targeting something like recovery, when they're trying to achieve recovery in an economy after something like a recession, and they're taking action but they're not measuring asset transfers, what you're likely to have as an outcome is speculation in asset bubbles because asset transactions are not taken into account in the GDP models. So take a look at this chart here, and this chart displays GDP, and then you have an input of monetary expansion. After that monetary expansion, you're going to have some of that go to the areas that are not included in GDP, and then the output is going to be the growth in GDP, which is a fraction of the total monetary expansion. Or put another way, growth in GDP is going to equal monetary expansion minus the leaks in the system. This goes back to why it's a flawed model in the first place, that it's a static, evenly rotating model, because this would show that minus monetary expansion, GDP cannot change. And that's how the model works, which is preposterous to assume that you can't have economic growth and progress without monetary expansion. Further than that, both growth and decline are actually impossible. Okay, so what about using the CPI as a deflator? What about adjusting these numbers with inflation to compensate for that? That's a common practice, and that's what most economists do, right? Well, I've talked at length about the CPI and why the CPI itself is flawed in another video. I'll link it in the description below, so you can check that out if you want a detailed view of why the CPI doesn't actually work and why it severely understates the amount of inflation that we actually have. But when you use more accurate, independent statistics on what inflation might be a little bit closer to, you're left with a GDP that has actually been in contraction since 2010. Let me say that again. If you account for the real increase in cost of living across the board and you adjust the official CPI numbers for what's close, a little bit closer to reality, that means GDP has most likely been in decline since 2010. Another example of this is going to be Argentina. As of December, independent estimates and statistics show that Argentina's inflation rate is somewhere around 78%. Contrasting independent sources are the IMF's numbers, which show that inflation for last year was going to be somewhere around 57-58%. Contrasting that with the official Argentina Treasury numbers, in September they said their inflation was going to be somewhere around 53%. If Argentina's official numbers are true, then their GDP would have only contracted by about 2.6% last year. But if we use what's probably more accurate in terms of real inflation numbers in Argentina, they're in a deep crisis. The financial crisis they're facing there is far greater than what their government or even the IMF is willing to admit. And that more closely resembles the story and the experience that most Argentinians are feeling right now. And that's why this is really important, because most Americans right now are feeling stretched. Most Americans are feeling like they can't make ends meet, that every month there's a little bit more month left at the end of the paycheck, that it's harder and harder to pay the bills, it's harder and harder to get by, things are becoming more expensive, but at the same time, we're hearing that there's no recession in sight and that this is the best economy ever, and they're seeing the stock market go up, and while they might have a little bit invested in their retirement plan, they're not seeing that translate in any way to their everyday lives and feeling more successful. More and more households are dual earning households. 2 people in a household are working more than ever before, and total household income has not actually increased. We've actually long-term seen a downtrend in total household income, despite there being 2 people working in the household versus 1 decades ago. And so we're being told the story that our lives are better than ever, yet the experience that most people are feeling are that things are getting harder and harder. Using today's calculations and today's models, if you were to overlay that on the experience in the Weimar Republic, I never know when you're talking about somebody else's culture whether you should use how they say it. It's a W, but they pronounce it with a V sound, just like we call it Germany, but they call it Deutschland. So Weimar, no idea. But if you overlay our current models and statistics and numbers on what they were experiencing during the Weimar Republic, post-World War I in Germany, it would have looked like their economy was doing extremely well due to the insane amount of monetary expansion that they had going during that time, contrary to the average person's experience of how much harder life was getting financially, until the final moment when everything kind of collapsed. Everything would have looked like business as usual. So let's put this all together. The only way that the flawed GDP model calculates growth is due to monetary expansion, an expansion of the total supply of money. The only way that we have an expansion of the total supply of money is through bank credit and the Federal Reserve printing money. The only way the Federal Reserve is going to continue to create more money, especially during times of bank credit contraction, which looks like we're about to get into a period of time of bank credit contraction, is with deficit spending that outpaces the the contraction. So is it any wonder that Trump has blown up the deficits? That he ran $1 trillion deficit last year and it looks like there's going to be a bigger deficit this year. Meanwhile, the world is dumping treasuries. Nobody's a net buyer of treasuries anymore. Central banks all around the world that used to be net buyers of treasuries to fund our deficit, they're not doing that anymore. They're actually selling it. The only buyer of the massive load of debt that the government is creating every year is the Federal Reserve. And so they're going to have to do this to continue to expand the money supply, because a fraction of the expansion of the money supply contributes directly towards GDP. And there are other studies that have been done that I might talk about at some point that show that a direct correlation between deficit spending, the government budget deficit each year, contributes directly towards the increase in GDP. So, are recessions a thing of the past? Quite possibly. But in reality, who cares? Because a recession is very simply 2 quarters in a row where the GDP declines. But the GDP is not actually an accurate representation of economic growth, progress, or average wealth of the average citizen, or income, or anything that has anything to do with most people's daily lives. And when you start to fix some of the errors in the GDP, it looks like we've been in economic contraction ever since 2010, despite there being emerging asset bubbles like the stock market bubble and a reflation of the real estate bubble. So at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter whether we have a technical recession or not, because it doesn't reflect what's actually going on in our economy anymore. The only problem with it is that it masks what is really going on, and most people just go along with it, and it allows the malinvestment, the misallocation of funds, the asset bubbles, the deficit spending, the wealth transfer from the public to continue under the radar until they finally push it past that invisible boundary that nobody knows where that invisible boundary is, but eventually it's going to hit. It's going to push past that invisible boundary, and confidence in the dollar will collapse, confidence in fiat currencies will collapse, we're going to have a crisis, and some of the consequences that should have been realized 10 years ago will start to unfold. Thank you for watching. If you do have any comments or questions, let me know below. Love to hear your thoughts. Really appreciate you tuning in. It means a lot. You guys have a great day.